Hello. Welcome to Reading Time. My name's Time, and this week we're reading Just So Stories by Rudyard Kipling. Let's get to reading. Just So Stories by Rudyard Kipling is a collection of fables, mostly about the origins of certain animal traits, as well as a collection of fables about the origin of the written language. The narrator of these stories tends to speak directly to the audience, oftentimes calling them my best beloved, in the tone that a father would talk to a child, and it is presumed that my best beloved refers to a daughter specifically. Now, I know that last week's book was also by Rudyard Kipling. If you haven't seen that already, I'll link that at the end of the video. And when I originally made the list, the comprehensive list based off of the poster that this entire thing is based off of, I tried to break everything up so that I didn't end up reading a lot of series back to back or a lot of picture books back to back. And so I kind of randomly sorted things based off of whether they were a novel, a collection, a picture book, or a series. And I also wanted to make sure that certain holiday themed books were actually read and posted around the holidays. And so that's how I organized it. But there are a couple of instances where I wasn't paying a lot of attention to the specific authors of said books. And so this is an instance where we have back-to-back Kipling, and I believe there's another instance down the line where I'm going to have the same author 2 weeks in a row. Now, because I did just read The Jungle Book, it may have made my reading of Just So Stories a little bit tainted, or I may have come into it with a certain expectation. And honestly, these books are both okay. I think the stories are generally enjoyable, and Kipling obviously has fun with playing around with language. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend reading both of these back to back, because I found that the same things I had issues with in The Jungle Book were present in Just So Stories as well. As such, I am rating this at 3 stars because I feel about the same way as I do for this book as I did with The Jungle Book. Although after this reading, I am tempted to bump both of them down to about 2.5 stars because reading them back to back made them not enjoyable for me. I'm not one who likes to sit down and read a lot of fables or fablesque stories. I do enjoy traditional literature, and I do think fables have a good place. But for me, it's a little hard to just sit down and read a lot of fables, especially when those fables are influenced and tinged by pro-imperialism and aren't actual original fables from a culture, but were made up by an individual. So I am going to put 3 stars down for the rating for this book, but know that it leans a little lower at times. For the content for this book, just as there was with The Jungle Book, there is some violence to be aware of, mostly violence between animals, such as you would expect to see in a sort of circle of life situation. But there's also one story that has a weird amount of spanking and talk of spanking in it, and I really did not enjoy that at all. Another thing to be aware of with this specific book is that there are a couple of racial slurs used in it, so you would want to be aware of that language as well. I know some more updated versions of Just So Stories has taken that out, but not all versions have edited that. Generally speaking, this would be a 4th through 6th grade reading level. Fables are relatively simplistic in style for literature and would be good for that age range. I would just be aware of what the content is and which fable you're having the student or child read. They could also be read in upper grades and analyzed a little bit more in depth, but that late elementary school, early middle school age range would be appropriate. Now, I talked a little bit about fables last time. Fables generally tell stories about how things came to be. And actually, this collection is a better example of fables than The Jungle Book. which I said was a good example last week. This is a much better example of fables. You can even look at the titles to see that it's a better example. For example, one of the stories is how the camel got his hump. There's another story that talks about how the written alphabet came to be. So stories that explain the creation of the world or the creation of certain animals or why certain animals have certain traits or why people behave in certain ways, those are all examples of fables. And oftentimes when we think of fables or when we think of myths, which are linked very closely, we tend to think of ancient cultures because oftentimes these forms of traditional literature hail from that oral language, that oral retelling of stories. As time progressed, these stories became written and became a little more solidified in their retelling. And so it's a little interesting to see fables written at a much later time period than a lot of the actual traditional fables were written. And it would be a good opportunity to have students try to write their own fables of how a certain animal came to be the way that they are, or why certain things in the world are the way they are. But I really don't have too much more to say about that because, as I said, I read The Jungle Book and reviewed The Jungle Book last week, and they feel very similar because they were written by the same author and cover similar ideas. So I'll leave it at that. For the poster square for this week, we are right here with a camel to represent that short story, How the Camel Got His Hump. So that was book 51 out of 100. We are now on the second half of our 100 children's books. If you are interested in following along with all 100 books, feel free to subscribe to the page if you have not already. And follow me on Facebook or Instagram for updates about what I'm reading. And as always, have a marvelous week and a wonderful read.